Hello everyone, welcome to the Distinguished Visiting Professors Series 2023. I am Professor Bruce McFarlane, Dean of the Faculty of Education and Human Development at the Education University of Hong Kong. In this lecture we are honoured to have Professor Yusef Waghid deliver his lecture entitled Rethinking the Decolonization of Education, Implications for Pedagogical Citizenship. Professor Waghid is a philosopher of education at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is a leading African philosopher of education and holds 3 doctorates in the fields of education, policy and philosophy from the University of the Western Cape and Stellenbosch University, respectively. A prolific author, Professor Waghid has more than 400 publications to his name, including journal papers, books and book chapters. Professor Waghid is an African philosopher of education intent on advancing democratic citizenship education, cosmopolitan education, and global citizenship education in the context of equity and justice for all. In doing so, he draws on multiple traditions of thought, most notably aspects of Western and non-Western theories of knowledge, to rethink the philosophy of education in an African context. In this lecture, Professor Waghid argues that the decolonization of higher education ought to be intertwined with a democratization of education if we are able to cultivate more plausible pedagogical encounters between university teachers and students. Professor Waghid will show how the decolonization of pedagogy ought to be reconstituted by the notion of democratic engagement, and why decolonized pedagogical encounters cannot be separated from disruptive action. He places social justice as a necessary outcome of such actions. Much is said and written about decolonization without necessarily moving this crucial debate forward in a positive way. But Professor Waghid's ideas provide us with a philosophically grounded but action-oriented approach. The decolonization of knowledge is one of the most important academic debates of our age, and Professor Waghid's contribution to this global dialogue is significant. As such, I'm sure you'll find his lecture thought-provoking and inspirational. We will now hear from Professor Yusef Waghid.
Good morning, good afternoon. I've entitled my presentation Democratic Citizenship Education Reimagined, and of course implications for a renewed African philosophy of higher education. So in this presentation, the notion of an African philosophy of higher education is rearticulated according to autonomous and deliberative iterations, human co-belonging, and the recognition of pluralist and defensible thought. Such a philosophy of higher education, that is an African philosophy of higher education, would go some way to produce ethically more defensible actions when it cultivates an ethics of autonomy, iteration, and co-responsibility. Based on analyses of contextual and textual matters, such a philosophy of higher education summons university teachers and students to resist their predicaments autonomously, iteratively, and co-responsibly. That is, they are urged to act ethically. So by way of introduction, over the last 3 decades, my own seminal thoughts in and about an African philosophy of higher education centered on a notion of democratic citizenship education. My central argument was couched as follows. Democratic citizenship education could enhance the notion of an African philosophy of education if enacted along the lines of deliberative iterations, co-belonging, and the enactment of encounters. So deliberative iterations hold people accountable for talking with one another in an atmosphere of openness and reflective thinking. Co-belonging engages them in attention to one another without any condition of belonging. And engagement in encounters make them responsible to one another in the pursuit of democratic experiences. Virtues of openness, reflective thinking, and unconditional responsible action connect with what constitutes an African philosophy of higher education. So what constitutes such philosophy? In other words, what makes an African philosophy of higher education what it is? In some academic circles, talking about an African philosophy of higher education is frowned upon. More recently, the exceptional contributions of several African thinkers have somewhat mitigated the skepticism shown towards such a philosophy of education. Over the last 2 decades in particular, the notion of an African philosophy of education has been approached from at least 3 points of view. Firstly, the Ghanaian scholar Kwasi Verido purports that an African philosophy of higher education advances the practice of decolonization, where human agency is considered as free, autonomous, and in defense, and this is the most important aspect, of an integrationist view of knowledge production. Pursuing the interests of a decolonized higher education system is synonymous with human actions founded on liberty, autonomy, and integration. When humans pursue higher education encounters in an unconstrained, self-reflective, and assimilatory way, they embark on a decolonized African philosophy of higher education. They are not always bound by hegemonic traditions of thought, but rather by a self-reflective manner. They unbiasedly assimilate thought patterns. For instance, as Verido remarks, any defensible form of higher education ought to consider Deweyan thought equally with that of Confucian ideas, which is a clear indication of his integrationist view of higher education. So, Kwasi Verido gives us a first touch of what an African philosophy of higher education constitutes. Secondly, the Ivorian scholar residing in the diaspora of the US, Ndri Asilamumba, she holds the view that a fusionist notion of an African philosophy of higher education offers stern resistance against any form of domination such as colonization, racism, and gender inequality. Now, what makes her view on African philosophy of higher education so compelling is that such a philosophy is oppositional to anything that subverts human dignity, respect, and equality. The hegemony of colonization clearly undermines and shames the dignity of Africans who have a legitimate right to be respected as humans and who should be treated in non-repressive and non-coercive ways. Now, the point about fusion is that on the continent of Africa, diverse human cultures should not be considered alien to any form of higher education. Instead, diverse and pluralist cultures ought to be recognized and fused with each other to cultivate some common notion of higher education, to which many Africans, of course, may be attracted. And failing to do so would undermine the possibility that an African philosophy of higher education could exist in some fusionist form. And that's the view of Ndri Asilemumba. The third view of what constitutes an African philosophy of higher education is espoused by our own work, my work in collaboration with Jose Cossa from Mozambique and my colleague Leslie Lagrange. And we advocate a notion of what is called Cosmo Ubuntu. And this notion of Cosmo Ubuntu is constituted in human action guided by virtues of openness, reflexivity, responsibility, dissonance, and the recognitions that humans have the potential to connect with all other humans, irrespective of their disagreements and modes of descent. Now, such a view of an African philosophy of higher education is premised on three pertinent virtues. One, that humans ought to engage with a reflective openness with one another. Two, that they endeavor to come up with new insights and ways of seeing the world. And three, that they attune themselves responsibly to action. And through critique and dissonance, then, they come up with new understandings of how they understand events in the world. So practicing Cosmo Ubuntu, we argue, is premised on the understanding that humans are reflectively open to one another and that they respond in a dignified and respectful way to one another in an atmosphere of coexistence and interdependence. And that's what we understand by Cosmo Ubuntu. So to sum up these three views, an African philosophy of higher education is based on the idea that human actions are unconstrained, self-reflective, and assimilatory, fusionist, and reflectively open to what is still to come in recognition of dignified, respectful, and interdependent action that could subvert, of course, injustice, inhumanity, and inequality, specifically on the African continent, but also elsewhere. So now that I have developed this particular notion of an African philosophy of higher education, I need to look at what the implications of such a philosophy of higher education are for higher teaching and learning. So firstly, an African philosophy of higher education requires that teachers and students act with autonomy. They have the legitimate right and freedom to make sense of that to which they have been exposed. So in this way, they are obliged to act autonomously. So autonomy then is exercised in such a way that students' potentialities are evoked to make sense of what they have been taught. So in turn then, students' learning depends on how well teachers have evoked their potentialities to consider pedagogical matters. So in this way, when we talk about the autonomy of teachers and students, which is derived from the notion of an African philosophy of higher education, teachers act with a sense of provocation, They provoke students to think for themselves, and in turn, students are evoked to use their potentialities to contribute to the conversation. So the second point then is, an African philosophy of higher education urges teachers and students to engage in iterative action. So they are independent and autonomous, yet they are encouraged to engage in iterative action. And this means, teachers and students articulate themselves in one another's presence, listen to one another's truth claims, and talk back to one another. And that's the important aspect. Talking back then in a spirit of critique and dissonance. So in this way, their deliberative encounters become iterative. So when they engage together in association, they listen, articulate, and talk back. And that kind of iterative action is what makes an African philosophy of higher education what it is. So pedagogical action is underscored and guided by this notion of iteration. And thirdly, as teachers and students, they endeavor to co-belong without any condition of belonging. So they have different identities, different subjectivities, yet they co-belong. Because it is through co-belonging that teachers and students enact their responsibility to look at things as it could be different, to look at things anew without being constrained by one another. As the American scholar Maxine Greene states, they look at things as it could be otherwise. So looking at things as they could be different requires a responsibility that humans ought to enact, and to be responsible towards one another. Teachers and students engage ethically in their pedagogical encounters, where ethical action, of course, is based on a sensitivity towards vulnerable others. They recognize the vulnerability of others and respond, yet continue to engage. But the most crucial aspect of acting responsibly towards one another is that teachers and students see themselves as answerable to one another, without dismissiveness and exclusion. So, acting ethically then in pedagogical encounters means that teachers and students consider one another's views as worthy of consideration. And what the renewed understanding of an African philosophy of higher education intimates is that pedagogical encounters between teachers and students are constituted by an ethical responsibility where teachers and students engage intimately and openly with one another so that encounters are never prematurely suspended. So in this way, ethical human encounters become just pedagogical actions in the sense that teachers and students remain open to one another and consequently responsive to one another. So the next part of my presentation then deals with the purposes of an African philosophy of higher education. So the question is, what are the purposes of an African philosophy of higher education? Like any philosophy of education, an African philosophy of higher education does not happen without purpose. I offer 3 justifications for why an African philosophy of higher education ought to be practiced. So if you ask the question why, you'll get to the purpose. So firstly, an African philosophy of higher education is a human activity. and it is aimed at identifying and analyzing frameworks of thinking that make up texts and contexts in and about African societies. It offers reasons and justifications why these texts and contexts are what they are, with a specific focus on extracting reasons for actions. Because understanding reasons that constitute context and text is what makes an African philosophy of higher education what it is. For instance, without understanding why universities on the African continent exist, is of course to be remiss of that for which an African philosophy of higher education is intended. And deriving some understanding of universities' raison d'etre provides some justification for their existence in the context of Africa. For example, all 26 public universities in South Africa are considered higher education institutions that ought to serve the public good. So the reason why they are universities is because they are intended to serve what is called the public good, as announced in documents of the Council on Higher Education. So that seems to be the first purpose. Secondly, understanding context and text on the African continent should be accompanied by an evaluation of the implications of such context for higher education, in the same way I showed how an African philosophy of higher education can implicate higher pedagogy, higher teaching and learning. So more specifically, an African philosophy of higher education is concerned with the framing of higher education practices according to autonomous, iterative, and co-responsible action. So in a different way then, doing an African philosophy of higher education brings an analysis of African texts and contexts, specifically the texts and context of African higher education institutions and practices, into conversation with the human action, commensurate or not, with autonomy, iteration, and co-responsibility. For instance, an African philosophy of higher education specifically asks questions about how autonomous, how iterative, and co-responsible university staff and students are. So in this way, an African philosophy of higher education offers one a framework to perform a textual and contextual analysis of higher education institutions and their practices. Thirdly, the third purpose, an African philosophy of higher education also has an ethical function, in the sense that the texts and contexts of higher education are analyzed according to their potential to offer resistance against forms of human injustice, specifically in the African context, gender, racial, and economic inequality. So more poignantly then, an African philosophy of higher education provides a framework according to which human injustices on the continent could be minimized and even eradicated. Therefore, both institutional and societal conditions are considered texts and contexts that ought to be analyzed and responded to in an ethical manner. So to sum up then, in relation to the three dilemmas in higher education on the continent, I offer some understanding of how an African philosophy of higher education could respond to these dilemmas. I've now outlined previously three main purposes of an African philosophy of higher education. And what I'm doing now is to identify three predicaments in higher education, three dilemmas higher education on the African continent and maybe elsewhere also are confronted with, and how the notion of an African philosophy of higher education can respond to these predicaments. And the three predicaments can be espoused as corruption and insecurity in university education, qualification theft and dishonesty, also in relation to university education, and of course institutional and societal violence. So violence which happens at the institution but also beyond the institution in the broader civil society. So these to me are three predicaments that the African continent has to deal with, but what I now offer is some justification as to how an African philosophy of higher education can be used to respond reasonably, adequately to these concerns, to these dilemmas. So in the first place, the predicaments I've mentioned that higher education faces, of course, on the continent, they ought to be analyzed contextually and textually. In other words, one would have to understand why, firstly, corrupt, dishonest, and violent practices manifest. You have to find out the reasons why they manifest. For example, the exposure of prominent political figures in the news for having received fake PhDs from a well-known university in Southern Africa is a vindication that corrupt and dishonest practices are rife at such a university. Yet when corruption was exposed at the university, an assassination attempt was made on the life of its institutional leader, the Vice-Chancellor, and that resulted in the killing of his bodyguard. The problem with corruption and insecurity is that when it becomes pervasive in a university or any other institution of higher education, it manifests at all levels of the academy, from its leadership to classroom practices and of course beyond. And if institutional officials can be bribed and threatened for their unwillingness to resist corruption, then there is something gravely wrong in our society. Of course, the rule of law must be implemented, and the assassination of a bodyguard and threats on the life of an institutional leader are matters for the police and the rule of law. However, if the reasons for these dilemmas are not analyzed textually and contextually, one would not be able to begin to understand the implications of these predicaments for higher education. Only then, of course, one can respond ethically to such situations. So, analysis of the problem or the dilemma. In the second instance, there is another dilemma on the continent, and that's what is known as qualification theft and dishonesty. And qualification theft and dishonesty are alarmingly evident through the exchange of what has become known as sex for marks scandal. At some universities in Southern Africa, female students are actually abused to offer sexual pleasures to some male academics, who in turn, of course, manipulate and inflate the achievement scores of these female students. Besides being corrupt, it seems as if some male academics use their unbridled authority to undermine academic integrity in higher education. Because if some lecturers can act so unprofessionally and indecently towards female students, it does not only show how pervasive patriarchal acts are in society, but also with what negative impunity some academics use their autonomy to disrespect women's bodies. In my own view, such acts are not only unprofessional but also deeply unethical, as academics cajole some women through bribery to hand over their bodies to sexual perverts, I would say, in exchange for a better academic score. In any case, the qualification, if eventually awarded, will be intellectually diluted because students would not have worked for its achievement. The implication for higher education is devastating in the sense that some students do not have to exert themselves intellectually in the pursuit of an academic qualification, and this palpably exacerbates an already skewed work ethic of many people in society. So that would be the second implication. In the third instance, some universities in Southern Africa in particular have become what is known as seedbeds for violence and intimidation due to irresponsible student protests. Now, undeniably, protesting increases in fees, tuition fees, and against reluctance on the part of some academics to address issues in and about decolonization, for example, that's legitimate. Especially considering that many poor students find universities' fees unaffordable. Equally, opposing then symbols of colonization and demanding that higher education curricula be decolonized are valid reasons for student upheavals. University leadership would therefore do well to engage students iteratively in respect of their authentic demands. The problem is that in some cases, institutional leadership is hesitant to engage student demands and hence acts unilaterally at times in its attempts to resolve student crises. But what is disconcerting is when peaceful student protests take on violent forms, such as barricading university entrances with burning tires, preventing staff from accessing their workplaces, or setting buildings, including libraries, alight, or even threatening lecturers with kidnapping and death. So when intimidation and violence escalate, it becomes the co-responsibility of academics and students to resolve the crises that confront them. And in this way, an African philosophy of higher education requires that teachers and students engage iteratively and co-responsibly with one another until the crises have been resolved. So in conclusion, I have made a case for an African philosophy of higher education, and this philosophy of higher education is inconclusive because if one were to say that everything is known about an African philosophy of higher education and there's no need for further expansion, that in any case would be the demise and death of such a philosophy of higher education. So in the main then, such a philosophy of higher education is concerned then with analyses of texts and contexts that guide higher education institutions and practices. And when the educational implications of dilemmas are considered and reconsidered commensurate with an ethics of autonomous, iterative, and co-responsible action, an African philosophy of higher education would have been practiced. Equally so, when the ethical ramifications of such a philosophy of higher education have been reconsidered, it seems authentic to talk about the legitimate implementation of such a practice of African philosophy of higher education. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Yusef Waghid, for joining us and for giving this important and timely presentation. It's great to see you and to have you with us today. For those of you tuning in online, my name is Liz Jackson, and I'm a professor here in the Department of International Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. It's my pleasure to chair this discussion panel, which includes Professor Waghid and our distinguished panelists. Before we begin, let me introduce my colleagues. First, we have Professor Loy Tai Lok with us. Professor Loy is Chair Professor of Hong Kong Studies and the Director of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies at the Education University. He's a well-known expert in studying Hong Kong society from sociological, economic, and policy perspectives. He's also worked in a variety of leadership roles at the Education University of Hong Kong, as well as the University of Hong Kong, Hong Kong City Polytechnic, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Next, we have Dr. Gizem Arat. From August, Dr. Arat will be Associate Professor in the School of Social Work at Dominican University in Illinois. Prior to that, she served as Assistant Professor and Research Assistant Professor at Lingnan University's Department of Sociology and Social Policy in Hong Kong, and as Postdoctoral Fellow in the Jockey Club Lab for Cultural Diversity Study at the University of Hong Kong's Faculty of Social Sciences. Dr. Arat is a social worker and researcher with a special interest in the interplay between social justice, resilience, and cultural diversity. Her scholarship has appeared in the British Journal of Social Work, Du Bois Review, Social Science Research on Race, and International Social Work. So thank you all so much for coming, and welcome to this panel.
Good morning.
So first, I would like to ask a few questions before we turn to my colleagues. So Professor Waghid, I really enjoyed your presentation, and in particular, your clear explications around the significance of decolonized African-oriented higher education. You mentioned the concept of Ubuntu in your presentation, and I know that you have wide-ranging interests in philosophy of education more generally. And I wanted to ask you about this term. I've noticed that this concept has gained international traction in recent years in comparative education, while its meaning and significance in the South African context, in my understanding, can be a little bit more complicated. So I noticed in the times that I've been in South Africa that people have a few different understandings of Ubuntu and its value. So I wonder if you'd just like to elaborate any more on what the concept means to you, and if you see it as a complicated concept in relation to post-colonial higher education.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Jackson, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. If one looks at the dictum Ubuntu ngumuntu ngabanye abantu, which is the isiXhosa, one of the indigenous languages in South Africa, if one looks at that dictum, it says a person is a person. And that to me is the key, which is often ignored in populist discourses with other persons. And it seems to me as if the emphasis is placed on the latter, that a person is a person with other persons. So what we sometimes, those thinking about the concept, are oblivious that a person is a person. And that implies that a person has autonomy, has freedom, has liberty, and a person can exercise her will. And that is the emphasis, which means that an understanding of Ubuntu cannot be associated exclusively with communitarian thinking. Because communitarian thinking exclusively would subvert the idea of human autonomy. So what we have done in our work is to accentuate the idea that Ubuntu is both an act of human autonomy, meaning that humans exercise their will and freedom, coupled with the idea that they do things in association with others. And in that sense, it has both what I would call a liberal, autonomous way of doing things, coupled with a communitarian way, which makes the idea of Ubuntu quite distinctive. Because while it emphasizes community, it does not subvert community by throwing away the position of the individual. So what Ubuntu then literally means that a person is a person with her autonomy, and she uses her autonomy in association with others. It can be that a community can do things together, but it does not mean that doing things together is independent from what individuals desire or what they proclaim. So in this, the distinctiveness of the term is then Ubuntu, meaning joining together, but with your individual autonomies.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I like how you you sort of complicate the term, because I think there is a risk that some scholars from like a Western international perspective might just try to summarize it and assimilate it as a communitarian concept. So I like the way that you explain, you know, what makes it quite distinctive, and it shouldn't be assimilated to Western or international perspectives. I have one more question, which is kind of on this same theme. Is what is the one thing that you most want global education actors and education researchers to learn from your work on decolonizing African higher education? So in particular, I'm wondering if there's something global actors you would like for them to do to assist or enable the process, or what do you think is the most important thing to develop a better understanding of the African situation among global researchers?
It develops from this notion of Ubuntu, whereas Ubuntu would imply a form of human activism, that we do things because we want to advocate a particular position and changing undesirable situations. So that to me is a form of activism, but also it's a form of oppositional thinking, resistance. So you want to offer resistance, and yet you want to change situations that are undesirable. But what makes the concept, and this is how my thinking is informed, what makes the concept unique is the fact that it allows for a kind of individual reflexivity, that you can think through situations and not merely act at your own volition or act blindly or unconsciously. So reflexivity means that you can think through the matter and revisit your positions again and again and again to come up with something more plausible. And in that sense, the reflexivity principle built into the acts of human understanding and interpretation will give rise, hopefully, to more informed activism and more plausible resistance.
Oh, great.
So when I think of what it is that I can contribute, it's to bring the notion to reconsider and reintroduce the notion of reflexivity again into acts of opposition, resistance, and activism.
Oh, that's wonderful and very inspiring. And I think that does kind of give some hopefully inspiration to a lot of people who will be thinking about your work from different global perspectives. So thank you for that. Now I'll hand over the time to my colleague, Professor Loy, who also has some questions for you.
Yes, thank you, Liz. Professor Waghid, thank you very much for your presentation. And same as Liz, I find it very thought-provoking, and I learn a lot from you. I very much following the same line of question, but I shifted a little bit towards the question of how. So do allow me for asking that kind of question, because I'm a sociologist. So after agreeing almost every word you said, inevitably I would think at the level of organization or institution, how to make it possible. For example, a very important concept in your discussion, of course, is co-responsible. Like what you have just said, individuals have to be reflexive while being autonomous, but at the same time to be aware of the bigger community. But then the challenge nowadays, of course, a lot of people will be saying is, yes, very true, but what would be the mechanisms for people to become aware of the need of being co-responsible? Yeah. What sort of institution or mechanisms that you have in mind to make it possible?
First of all, colleagues and I, so it's not my own independent thoughts, but it's informed by what I do together with some colleagues. Colleagues and I, we argue that higher education is not a site of neutrality. So there will invariably be engagement and contestation and conflict. And what we say, what we argue, is that unless higher education is going to be used as what we call a pedagogical site for confrontation and agreement, it might not advance the aspirations of a decolonized idea of African education or African philosophy of higher education. So that means the institutional site where these acts of change and transformation have to occur is, in fact, the institution itself. And in our case, it would be the university. And when things were to happen at university, it means that your acts of pedagogy, and that's why we do not delink teaching from learning, because in as much as you teach, you learn, and in as much as you learn, you teach. So that combination of teaching, learning, we never separate. And we advocate that these notions of reflexivity, of iteration, deliberation, and co-belonging happen there through our pedagogical acts of teaching and learning, and even how we manage and govern the institutions itself. So what we propose is that the pedagogical site of agreement, because if there's not going to be agreement, nothing will really ensue. But if there's also not going to be dissonance, disagreement, it might be that we become too complacent. So in order for agreement to manifest, and in order for an institution to advance, there has to be a notion of dissent. It's the old Foucauldian idea of, I have to challenge you in order that your thinking becomes better, or in order that you reconsider your thoughts, in order that you sit back and reflect if you are doing is correct or not. So dissonance complemented with agreement, that those are the ingredients that are necessary for this pedagogical site of higher education to manifest more tenably?
Thank you. But if you allow me to follow up with my question, is I mean, your arguments are well taken, and I think this is what you've just said is very, very important. But at the backdrop of that discussion, I personally would think it requires participants in the engagement to share a sense of time. That is, you would allow me to finish my sentence as something as simple like this, even though that what I'm saying probably you find disagreeable, but you will allow me to finish it so that we will be able to engage with each other.
Yeah.
But one of the challenge or predicament that nowadays we are facing, and like what you said in the three dilemmas and predicaments that you discussed in your presentation, is that probably nowadays a lot of us have lost the patience. Instead of allowing you to finish your sentence right from the very beginning, I would say that you are not allowed to say what you want to say. Even before you iterate your first sentence, you would be stopped. And that's why we get into conflict and even intense confrontation and even violence, is because in this new sense of times everyone is making the point without being iterative or deliberative. And would you agree that this would probably have a very major challenge of the contemporary world?
What you present might sound so mundane or perhaps even innocuous, but it's so significant that articulation alone requires the patience and the composure to allow the person to speak her mind. And if one allows a person to speak her mind, it means that we have to become good listeners. You cannot just have a form of articulation that is unnecessarily or unjustly interrupted without the person even having made a point. So, yes, articulation has to happen smoothly, but for articulation to be considered seriously, it requires serious listeners. So you cannot have good deliberation if there's not a justifiable articulation where people are allowed to speak their minds, and also good listening. So this interplay between speaking and listening is so important for any deliberation to consider. How can you say you deliberate if nobody else listens to you? How can you say you deliberate if you weren't even allowed to complete your sentence? Because deliberation means that you have to listen to others, allow them to speak so that you can make a judgment about what they have said. And you can only make that judgment about what people have articulated if you have allowed them to speak their minds. So deliberation then does not only require speak and interjection. Deliberation requires articulation, let people speak their minds, listening, allow them to speak their minds so that you can make sense of what they have said. And more importantly, once you have listened to what they had to say, then you can talk back. So talking back means you can then take into controversy what they have said. You can criticize as you wish, but justifiably. So those three elements for me is what makes a pedagogical site of agreement and disagreement plausible. It has to have articulation and eloquence, allow the person to speak her mind. Secondly, listen to what they have to say, because it's no use criticizing and you haven't listened to what has been said. And more poignantly, talk back, but on the basis of what has been heard. And then you can talk about deliberative iteration. as an act of pedagogy.
Thank
So
you.
I actually agree with you.
Okay. Do you have any more questions, Professor Loy, or is
No,
that...
not at the moment.
Okay, well, in that case, I will now pass the time to Dr. Arat.
Thank you so much, Professor Jackson and Professor Waghid. I really enjoy your presentation, and it was very fascinating to learn about decolonization of higher education in Africa. And as just like my colleagues, I will ask about like Ubuntu as well, because it was very interesting to me as well. I haven't heard it before, probably, unfortunately. And since I'm also interested in social justice, and I look from the perspective and the other fields like social justice, social work as well. So I would like to ask you how we can really translate Ubuntu into Asian settings. For instance, in Hong Kong, generally social harmony is more prioritized than social justice. So meaning that we don't really, in terms of social harmony, we also look for group identity over individual identity. So how we can really translate this into an Asian setting? So this is my first question. Thank you so much.
Whereas the literature seems to be replete with discussions of Ubuntu, often we remain somewhat oblivious, I argue, of two other concomitant terms. And the one is ukama, which is very much in line with what you are making, the claim you are making. Whereas Ubuntu is recognizing your individuality in association with others, ukama says that your relationship with others remains relational, meaning that whatever the group decides and whatever identity the group is attuned and attached to, that kind of identity can only be understood and made sense of by others if there's a relationship between them. So what Ubuntu says, you cannot talk about a group of people as if they function in isolation and that only their preferences are significant and important and others do not matter. That's why Ubuntu introduces another term which is called ukama. What you have and consider as sacrosanct and meaningful is only so in relation to the others that matter and the others that are relationally distant from you. In other words, what is being advocated in literature on Ubuntu is that human independence, human autonomy, human association cannot be authentic, and the emphasis is on authentic, if we do not consider what others have to say. Because if we consider what others have to say, then we immediately recognize what Ubuntu wants us to do, and that is recognize others who are different to you. Recognize others who might not be doing the same things in exactly the same way you do. So Ubuntu associates, one can argue, are often attuned to ideas of ukama, meaning relationality, that I cannot just think of myself as the utmost important person or group in the world at the expense of others who I might rebuke or denigrate or think nothing of. That would not foster a notion of association or togetherness or human interdependence, because human interdependence requires on recognizing the relationship one has with others. So just to make the point short, human interrelationships, relationality is important in the association and interdependence of humans. So I cannot just claim that my rights and my responsibilities are the utmost important at the expense of what others think, what others feel, and what others desire. And that's where the notion of ukama, the African ethic of ukama, is actually supportive of the idea of Ubuntu, but which seems to be underplayed.
Thank you so much for your reply. Actually, in existing study literature, if we look for social harmony and social justice, it is actually seen by many scholars as opposed poles, which I believe they should be going hand in hand as well in Asian settings. So it's really related, your topic scholarship related to like Hong Kong setting as well. So I have one more only actually one follow-up question as well. Since we discuss about literature, so how we can really apply this in our real world? So I'm trained as a social worker. In fact, I work as a social worker as well in my home country, which is Turkey. So I just want to ask, like, if we try to apply the concepts as a practitioner, let's say in education or another field like social work, so how can we really collaborate with other stakeholders? For instance, in the States, like social workers generally rely on cultural competency. Right now, they call it like cultural humility as well. But when you check the existing studies, as well as if you have a conversation with the social workers, US-based social workers, they still think that there is a predominance of white-centric approach. So we don't really see the translation of the concepts we have discussed. So what do you think, like, we should really bear in our mind that we can really translate the concepts in other settings?
Okay, very, very important question. So I think I can only go back to the non-dichotomy between what we say theory and practice. If we do not have clarity about the concepts, the ideas that we have and want to work, then those ideas would be difficult in its manifestation. It will not happen. So if I do not have some understanding of what human deliberation means, it will be difficult for human deliberation to be to manifest, to unfold, and to make sense of what we mean by deliberation. So the point is, having more clarity about the concepts that we use implies some connection with theory, that before you can act and want things to change, to happen, you have to have clarity about the concepts you're using. So your theoretical understandings, your constructs, you should make sense of it. It should make sense to you and to those you're working with. And even that in itself, this is the controversial, perhaps not so, point. Even that in itself is an act of practice. Because if the human mind makes sense of concepts and imagines and thinks through how it will work, you are performing a practice in your mind. So in as much as we say that use the allegory of Plato in the cave, Plato must have had some understanding of society, of where he lived. Like Diogenes must have had some idea of cosmopolitus, of what he understood as the cosmopolitan citizen. And it's not just that he was confined to Greece without thinking about what a cosmopolitan being ought to look like. So even if you think about a particular concept and how it can work and not work, that in itself is a form of practice. But that practice will become manifest if you actually show how ideas like Ubuntu, Ukama, and other concepts can actually work in society, whether it's the institutions you work at, whether it's the broader society, whether it's the regions that you think about and make judgments on. When you can show that your concepts have meaning for societal change, then you have fused the notions of theory and practice. And that's why it's important for me to say this. That's why in all my readings of African writings, like whether it's the work of Kwasi Beridu, whether it's the work of Ndri Lumumba, they all spoke about this fusionist approach to knowledge production. But what is meant by it, that you cannot just think about something without considering the practical ramifications of that something. So there was also this integrationist understanding of what a theory should look like and how it will manifest in practice. And this combination of theory practice would in fact disrupt this unnecessary divide that we think at the university and we do outside the university. So thinking, which is really poiesis, and praxis, doing things, are integrated. And Aristotle is often criticized for separating poiesis and praxis. That's not my reading of Aristotelian thought. For me, Aristotle combined the idea of poiesis, the process, and arriving at the product, which is the praxis. So that integration is what we're talking about between theory and practice, between the things that we contemplate about and the things that we want to happen in society, in our institutions and in our social practices. So one has to argue for that integration and never separate it. I try to do it in my own discourses by never separating teaching from learning. So when I teach, I consider myself as provoking my students to come to speech. And when they learn and I learn, then it means that our potentialities as persons have been evoked. So in that sense, we never separate teaching and learning. So it's in that vein that I say it's so unnecessary to separate important actions and practices and categorize it as this is theoretical and this is practical. There is always a theoretical component to a practical action, and there's always a practical action to a theoretical component. So that integration would perhaps help.
Thank you so much. I think they were great insights as well.
Great. Well, I believe that wraps up our discussion today. Thank you so much to our distinguished visiting professor and our distinguished panelists for contributing to a lively discussion. Today, we've thought about the decolonial project in African higher education from individual theoretical and philosophical perspectives and how to operationalize these concepts in conflicting communities, organizations, and through reflexive pedagogical acts of teaching and learning and governance. We've discussed the importance of listening for articulation and deliberation processes, and how to think about Ubuntu and Ukama in the East Asian context, and how to apply these concepts and theories through praxis as educational and other kinds of practitioners. I know I found this discussion really inspiring, and I'm sure many colleagues around the world will also learn a lot from this. So this concludes our panel. It was really great to see you all, and many thanks again to all of you.
Thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I would like to thank Professor Waghid for providing fresh insights into ways of realising the decolonization of pedagogy in Southern Africa. I also want to thank panellists Professor Jackson, Professor Lui, and Dr. Arat for their generous and insightful discussion on the global picture of democratization of education. Our faculty will continue to collaborate with the world's most distinguished scholars to share insights on educational issues. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you and goodbye.